Okay, so as per usual, remember to finish the vocab quiz over the weekend. I'll send you a reminder both tomorrow morning and on Sunday. And for Tuesday, you're going to be reading the next 3 stories in Dubliner, Ivy Day in the Committee Room, A Mother and Grace. This is the set that's concerned with Dublin social life and with social institutions. So as you're reading these stories, when you're reading Ivy Day, go back and consult the stuff we said about home rule and about Charles Stewart Parnell. For A Mother, you might want to go back and check out some of the stuff that we've said about cultural nationalism. Particularly like if you go back to some of the stuff that we talked about with Yeats, for example. That'll help you understand some of what's going on there. Grace. I don't think we've really talked a whole lot about Catholic doctrine, so some of that kind of stuff might come up today, but otherwise I don't have a lot of past stuff for you here for you to draw on for assistance. And it is warm in here, right? It's not just me. Okay. I apologize for that. I think it mostly has to do just with us not having control over the temperature in the building. Other things. So your paper 1 proposal is going to be due on Tuesday as well. As far as that's concerned, I promise I will look at anything that you send me in advance if I get it within at least 48 hours before the due date, right? So if it's due Tuesday, you get me something by Sunday, I promise that I will look at it and comment on it for you. If I get it after Sunday, I will look at it and give you comments if I have time. But yeah, as a general rule, anything that you send me more than 48 hours before the due date, I promise I will look at and give you feedback before you turn it in. I have also passed out to you here some sample questions for the midterm. So these are just to help you study and to give you some idea of the kinds of themes I expect you to be familiar with on the exam. Next week, I will also give you a kind of whittled down bank of vocabulary words to study. So there will be, on the exam, 12 vocab words. You'll choose 8. I'll give you a list of about 25 that you should know. So that's a kind of significant whittling down from the bank that you have from the vocab quizzes. Yeah, Nick?
We're going to read the dead before the midterm, right?
Yes, we're going to read the dead. Actually, we'll be talking about the dead a week from today.
Okay.
So yeah, everything in Dubliners will be on the exam. Everything up to and including the dead is going to be on the exam. Does anybody have any other questions about the exam or about the paper?
Is it like in class or is it like on the midterm, schedule?
Oh, we'll be doing it in class. Yeah. There isn't like a separate, it's not like with finals where there's a separate exam schedule. No, we'll just be doing it in class. And in fact, depending on how my jury duty goes, I guess they got the date wrong for my jury duty. They initially sent me a letter that said the 22nd. Now they're telling me the 28th. So that may affect what goes on in the midterm exam. I'm sure I can probably get a colleague to just sit here and watch you take an exam. That shouldn't be too hard. So it shouldn't affect you, but it might affect what I'm doing on that day. God, I hope I don't get picked. Any other questions about the test or about the paper? Okay, one last thing I will say is that the sample questions I've given you here are very general. The ones on the exam will be much more focused, much more specific, and will ask you to reference specific texts. So if you're prepared to answer 2 of these questions, maybe with a couple of different texts plugged in, then you will be in pretty good shape for the exam. Yeah, Nick?
It's a 1 essay exam, right?
Yeah, the midterm is 1 essay. The final will be two short essays, but yeah, the midterm you only have to write 1. All right. Anything else? Okay. Then let's jump back into the text. So let's start today with any questions that you guys have about anything that you read today that might have been confusing or strange? Was there anything that you want clarification on to help you understand what's going on in some of these stories? Is there anything that y'all just like didn't get or that you felt went over your heads? Because I think there are some more specific cultural references in some of these stories.
They're in Clay.
Uh-huh.
Maria wants to join a convent, but even though she seems to be in something that's similar to a convent already.
Okay, so here's what's going on in both of those instances there, right? So we'll start with the thing that she already belongs to, right? What she belongs to is not actually a convent. She works at a laundry company called Dublin by Lamplight. Now, this explanation is going to get a little bit long, so just bear with me. Dublin by Lamplight isn't a convent. It's what's called a Magdalen home. Have any of you ever heard of these before?
I've heard the name Magdalene.
Okay, in what context have you heard the name Magdalene before?
Mary Magdalene.
Okay, yeah, Mary Magdalene, who in the Gospels is one of the first disciples of Jesus, right? And somehow in the 6th century gets conflated with the woman who was taken in sin and is then kind of like regarded as a kind of reformed prostitute from that time forth, right? Even though there's actually kind of no indication of that in the actual Gospels, but I digress. So Magdalene homes were run by religious organizations as reformatories for prostitutes or other fallen women, right? You know, according to the whole Victorian angel in the house, fallen woman trope, right? So a lot of the women were actually not, who lived in these homes were not actually prostitutes. Many of them simply had children out of wedlock, for example. And conditions in these homes varied, right? In some of the worst of them, the women had their heads shaved, they had their names changed, and in pretty much all cases, they had their children taken away from them and placed in the care of the state. So a lot of the orphans who lived in Irish orphanages like really kind of up into the 1970s weren't really orphans. They were the children of, you know, these women in the Magdalene homes. Dublin by Lamplight was a real Magdalene home. So this is a real business that Joyce is talking about. And Dublin by Lamplight was a Church of Ireland run organization. So it was Protestant. Though we know that Maria is Catholic, and it seems like given the names, like Ginger Mooney and Lizzie Fleming, most of the women in the home are also probably Catholics. So to put this into context, so we already talked about Dublin being the syphilis capital of Europe in the 19th century, right? There are a couple of reasons for this. One, right, it's a major port. So there are sailors coming in and out all the time. There were also 5,000 British soldiers garrisoned in Dublin. To put this into perspective, the total population of Dublin around 1904, when the story was written or begun, was about 400,000. So that's a really large number of soldiers in proportion to the population, right? This meant that prostitutes did not lack for clients. There were kind of plenty of non-native transients always coming through Dublin, either on ships or on military assignments. I also alluded a couple of sessions ago to Dublin's red light district. It was called Monto in North Dublin. And brothels operated more or less openly there. They weren't quite legal, but there was a kind of like nudge, nudge, wink, wink arrangement with the authorities. So yeah, in Dublin, around the turn of the 20th century, prostitution is a fairly big deal. Again, like in terms of numbers here, remember we're talking about a population of 400,000, and in 1904, there were 500 women arrested for prostitution. This is just those who were arrested, right? Not all of those who were, as Corley puts it in 2 Gallants, on the turf. By way of comparison, the same year, 1904, London had a total population of 7 million. And in the same year, about 4,300 women were arrested for prostitution. So if we're talking about proportions of the population here, if we're talking about percentages, there's a much kind of higher percentage of this going on in Ireland than in London, which is a much larger city. So Maria, to be clear, is not a prostitute, right? Is not a reformed prostitute. She simply works in this establishment as like what's still called a matron, right? So various kinds of, like in British English, a matron is basically, you know, like any kind of institutional domestic servant, right? So, you know, somebody who runs or works in the kitchen, or, you know, housekeeping staff, things like that, right? They're all referred to as matron. So she is an assistant matron in Dublin by Lamplight. Now, the thing that's going on with the convent, so what they're playing at the party is a divination game called Saucers. And what you do in this game is you lay out a bunch of teacups or saucers with different objects in them. And you approach the table wearing a blindfold, and the object you grab is supposed to like predict your future in the coming year, right? So if you get the ring, that's a prediction of marriage. You get the water, you're going to emigrate, which again, like, was a huge, like, that was a huge deal in turn of the 20th century Ireland, right? It was a net exporter of people. More people left than came in. The population just kept shrinking. If you got the coin, that was a predictor of wealth. If you got the bean, that predicted poverty. The salt stood for luck. If you got the button or the thimble, it meant you were going to die unmarried. The prayer book meant that you were going to take religious orders. And can anybody guess what the clay would have meant? some families would omit the clay when they played the game at Halloween.
I didn't know what it meant when I was reading it. I looked it up, and it said that it was like an early death.
Yes, exactly. The clay signified death, right? So when Maria sticks her hand in the kind of wet substance, right, she got the clay. And then, the mother, Joe's wife, gets upset with the children for including the clay in the game and says, no, that's not fair, take that away, right? And then, oh, you got the prayer book, you're going to go into a convent, right? So that's what's going on here. This actually relates back to the cake that she's serving out to the women in the home at the beginning as well. Like, so barmbrack, for those of you who don't know, is a kind of fruit cake. And okay, so barmbrack isn't actually taste-wise anything like this. But any of you familiar with king cake and with the New Orleans king cake tradition? Okay, what happens with king cake?
They hide a baby Jesus.
yeah, they
And
hide
then
a
you
baby
get
Jesus.
the king cake. You
Uh-huh.
have to make the king cake for next year.
Yeah. So barmbrack is a similar kind of divination game that's played with the cake, right? But instead of baking a baby Jesus into it, you bake a ring into it, and whoever gets the slice with the ring is going to be the next person to marry, right? So both of these little Halloween divination games kind of bracket both ends of the story. So does that answer your questions, Nick?
Yeah, that makes it a little.
Okay, good, thank you. Any other questions about stuff that's going on in these stories? Anything else y'all were confused about? Yeah, Hannah.
At the end of this story, I was in this one play. Is there something going on with her and the husband, Maria and the husband?
You mean like something sexual?
Yeah.
No, what the probable relationship is here between these characters, and it's never made clear exactly how she's related to these people.
Yeah, I was kind of confused
But-
about that. But at the end, he said Joe was very much moved, and then he just asked his wife to tell him what a corkscrew was. It seemed like it was a subject or something.
Yeah, well, he wants the corkscrew to get more drink, right?
Right.
So that it's kind of hinted throughout the story that Joe might be an alcoholic. But yeah, so Maria,
Was she their nanny or whatever, Joe's brother?
He calls her his mom.
yeah, mother is
She,
mother,
has
but
something
Maria
to
is
do
mama,
with
yeah.
Raising them.
Yeah, that she seems to have had something to do with raising Joe and his brother Alfie, right? Who are estranged from each other.
But his oldest son is named Alfie.
Yeah. Well, they probably weren't always estranged from each other, right?
She says they're constantly falling in and out.
Yeah. That these two boys that she apparently helped raise fall out a lot. So Maria's situation is probably that of what is sometimes called a poor relation. Right? That is kind of like a relative who left without resources on her own had to be taken in by the family at some point. Maybe put to work as some kind of domestic servant. So, in this case, she went and she raised the boys basically. And now the boys have helped her to get a job in this institution, right? Once the family, she mentions the breakup at home, right? But it's never specified what that is exactly. And that's actually one of the things that is specifically modernist about Joyce's stories, is that there's always a suggestion of something going on that it doesn't quite explain to you, right? There's much more kind of under the surface than is told to you. But yeah, so once she's no longer able to work for the family anymore, they put her in this home here, and get her a job here. And so now she is reasonably independent and makes her own money. So, what was the actual question again? I feel like I might have wandered off topic.
Oh, if Maria and Joe were
Right. Okay, right. So what's interesting about what happens there at the end of the story is, this is actually the song that I was playing for you at the beginning of class. It's by the Irish composer Michael William Balfe, who wrote several popular Victorian sentimental operas, but nobody listens to them now because, well, they're kind of crap. But there are 2 verses to the song that Maria sings. And we can actually see the second verse if we turn to page 474 in the endnotes here. So can I get somebody to read this for us, starting with, "I dreamt that suitors besought my hand." And then that might help us figure out the significance of it.
I dreamt that suitors besought my hand, the nights upon bended knee, that night upon bended knee.
Mhm.
And with vows no maiden heart could withstand, that they pledged their faith to me. And I dreamt that one of this noble host come forth my hand to claim. And I also dreamt, which charmed me most, that you loved me the same. Still the same.
Uh-huh. So why do you think Maria might have consciously or unconsciously skipped this verse? And just gone back and sang the first one again?
I got a little bit of the feeling that she's getting older
Mhm.
and she's getting very forgetful.
Okay. Yeah, there is some, particularly, she leaves the plum cake on the tram, right?
She has to keep like repeating things to herself in her mind. Like the entire day she's going over how much money she's going to spend on this, where she's going to go for this. Like she's constantly repeating tedious things to herself. She's very tedious in her work and how she slices the cake, how she arranges things, which makes me think that she may be struggling with some
I think
sort of...
maybe meticulous would be a better word than tedious, right? And she seems to be actually really effective and well-liked in her job, right? But then once she leaves Dublin by lamplight, once she goes back out into the streets, she seems to be completely out of her depth. People jostle her, no one pays any attention to her. She loses the plum cake. She takes too long making a decision in the bakery, so the shop girl gets angry and is rude to her. And then even when she gets to the party, right, she's upset because she lost the plum cake. She blames the children, kindly, but they get annoyed. And then she forgets, she's unable to make peace between Joe and Alfie, and she forgets the second verse of the song. So outside of this world where she is used to operating, she seems to have a lot of trouble kind of like navigating everyday life, right? But I think there's something specific going on here as well that relates to the song. So they make jokes about the barmbrack, right? And the ring. And apparently one of the women who seems to have been there for quite some time, because she's been doing this for years, jokes that Maria's going to get the ring.
Is she like ugly?
Well, we're told that she has a long nose and a long chin, right?
Oh, yeah.
That almost kind of touch each other. So the way she's described kind of looks almost like the traditional description of a witch or a hag. More on that maybe in a moment. But yeah, so there's the ring and the cake, right? The ring and the barmbrack. And then the shop girl, when she's rude with her, angry with her, what's the rude question that she asks Maria? If we look on 102. Here she was a long time in suiting herself, and the stylish young lady behind the counter who was evidently a little annoyed by her, asked her was it wedding cake she wanted to buy. That made Maria blush and smile at the young lady. But the young lady took it all very seriously and finally cut a thick slice of plum cake, parceled it up, and said, 2 and 4, please. Now, one of the things that is slightly ironic about the wedding cake reference here is that plum cake actually is often served at Irish weddings. And then to add to this, when she sings, I dreamt I dwelt, right? What does the verse that she forgets start with?
What was it, suitors?
Yeah, suitor's on bended knee, right? So there's this discourse throughout the story, right? That consistently reminds us of Maria's single state, right? That, yeah, this is an older woman who has never married. And is never likely to. So yeah, I think you were correct in sensing that there's something strange in the relationship between Maria and Joe, but it's almost the opposite of, like of anything sexual, right? In fact, like one of the things that the story seems to point out about Maria is a kind of asexuality.
So like, with him like tearing up at the end and stuff, is it because he was like upset for her that like she's never going to be married?
Well, he might also be drunk.
Well, yeah.
I think that's probably the more likely thing, right? But I mean, he's also, maybe like, we know that the family is not whole here either, right? The family is broken. So one of the possible significance of this being a Halloween setting, or Hallows Eve, right? Part of the significance of the holiday of the evening is that it's when all of your relations, living and deceased, are supposed to come back home. And there is a family member conspicuously absent. Right? Not everybody's home. Okay, other questions you guys had?
Well, I mean, I knew what they were talking about, but why do they call liquor hot punch?
Okay, so hot punch actually refers specifically to whiskey punch.
Okay.
So it's like whiskey with hot water and sugar.
Okay. I knew they were talking about alcohol in some form.
Yeah.
It was just, I was like, hot punch, okay. I mean, I guess it burns, but I don't know.
Yeah, whiskey punch is probably would have been a more popular drink in 1905 than it is today.
Yeah.
It sounds interesting.
Yeah.
The one story we were reading, I can't remember if it was from today or last time, the guy went to the bar and he was like, yeah, I want like more water in my whiskey.
Right, little Chandler wants them to water his whiskey down a lot,
like,
right? Yeah. Yeah. Like traditionally the way to take it, right? The best way to take it is with just a splash, right? Everybody's 21 here, right?
I turned 21 Saturday.
All right, well there we go. But yeah, so that's all hot punch is, right? And Tailors of Malt are just glasses of whiskey. So yeah, in Counterparts, they do consume an awful lot of whiskey.
What is the, it starts with an A, I think, in Counterparts, that he ends up buying that guy?
Okay, Apollinaris.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, this is actually kind of a big deal as well, right? Because it also suggests certain levels of cultural difference.
Mhm.
So Weathers, the guy who wants the Apollinaris and whiskey, what do we gather about Weathers from the story? About how he might be different from Farrington and his friends.
He's more of an artist.
Yeah, well, he's a music hall artiste, right? So he's a performer in a music hall show, in a vaudeville show. Specifically, we're told he's an acrobat, right? Which also, like, frankly, makes it so that, like, no one should really be surprised that he beats Farrington in the arm wrestling match, right? Like, here's, a young guy who's a professional acrobat who, is probably in peak physical condition, whereas Farrington is a middle-aged drunk. So it shouldn't be any surprise that he loses in the arm wrestling contest. But so, what do we get about were you able to figure out anything about Weathers' nationality compared to the others, right? When they're doing the arm wrestling match, Farrington is told to go uphold the national honor. Why is that?
He's English.
Weathers is English, exactly. And Apollinaris is an expensive French mineral water. This is why Farrington regards him as a sponge, right? Because when he's asked what he wants when, Farrington's buying the round, he asks for something that's more expensive than what everybody else has been drinking. And Farrington, to keep up appearances, is obliged to provide. Despite the fact, what has Farrington done to get the money?
On his watch.
Yeah, he had to pawn his watch to get the money to go on this drinking spree, right? And he's basically spent his whole day being humiliated. Probably most of his career in Crosby and Allen being humiliated. And we can tell that he must also have a serious alcohol dependency, because he's slipping out for drinks in the middle of the workday, right? He sneaks down to the pub for a glass of porter in the afternoon, after already having apparently had several at lunch. So there is also something else I kind of want to point out about Farrington. What's his job? What does he do for this? What's that?
He's a copyist?
Yeah, he's a law copyist, right? Just like.
Chandler.
Yeah.
Yep.
He has the same job as Little Chandler. So when we're talking about counterparts, right? We could actually probably have, Joyce could probably have used this title for the entire collection. Right? Because we're seeing so many of these connections between these stories, right? So Farrington and Little Chandler are both law copyists. And there's even a slight physical resemblance between them. Right? We know, for example, that Little Chandler had, fair hair and mustache that he was very attentive to and vain about, right? Farrington is described as having fair eyebrows and mustache. So they have the same job, the same hair color, and they're both unhappily married. But can I get somebody to, so if we look on page 86 here, can somebody read for me the physical description that's given to us of Farrington? It's the paragraph that starts with, "The man muttered, 'Blast him.'" It is on page 86, first page of the story.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Under his breath, and pushed back his chair to stand up. When he stood up, he was tall and of great bulk. He had a hanging face, dark wine-colored, with fair eyebrows and mustache. His eyes bulged forward slightly, and the whites of them were dirty. He lifted up the counter and, passing by the clients, went out of the office with a heavy step.
Okay, now let's pause there for a second, and I want to go back to 2 gallons. If we look on page 56, the physical description of the girl that Corley is taking out. Can I get somebody to start reading from "Her features were blunt"?
Her features were blunt. She had broad nostrils, a straggling mouth which lay open in a contented leer, and 2 projecting front teeth.
All right, stop there, right? So what Joyce is doing in both of these physical descriptions is playing on certain English stereotypes about the Irish, right? So I'm going to show you a couple of images from Victorian cartoons that showed how English and often also American cartoonists typically depicted the Irish. And I want you to kind of look for some common elements here. Right, so here we have John Bull representing England and Uncle Sam representing the United States, going to give this great big bloated leprechaun a whooping, right? As he, wields his knife and club while smashing and dancing on all of these commodities here. Right, here we have a depiction of an Irish nationalist sitting with a lit torch on top of a barrel of gunpowder, surrounded by his wife and children. And here we have a portrait of a rural Irish farm couple as imagined by an English cartoonist, right? So are we noticing any common elements across these images?
Ape-like.
Yeah. They're depicted as kind of ape-like, right? What else?
The mouth, like the front teeth, like you were talking about.
Yeah, slack-jawed, right? Open mouth, bad teeth.
Angry.
Yeah, angry and senselessly violent, right? We have, the leprechaun dancing with the knife, right? We have the guy sitting on top of the barrel of gunpowder.
The wife in this one looks very angry at her husband.
Uh-huh.
He's got a bucket on his head.
He does indeed. But they also look very much like each other, right? Right, she might look angry at the husband. And then in the other image that we just saw, right, the wife and children are depicted as innocent here, right? They just kind of look like anybody. It's the husband who is clearly thoughtlessly endangering his family by opposing British policy in Ireland. And to kind of drive home these stereotypes, here we have a cartoon featuring Mr. G. Orilla trying to write poetry. So where Little Chandler embodied the kind of Irish artist stereotype without actually producing any art, Farrington is a kind of embodiment of this other Irish stereotype, right? this kind of like ape-like creature who lives only, for senseless violence and to satisfy its own wants. And indeed, like, when we kind of get glimpses into Farrington's imagination, right? What sorts of things does he fantasize about? Like when he's looking at his boss's bald head.
Smashing it in.
Yeah. We're told he's gauging the fragility of the skull, right? It's like, how easy would it be to just crack that open?
He compares it to an egg.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's interesting here is the way his thirst and his rage are kind of conflated with each other, right? Every time he feels humiliated at work, right, he gets thirsty. He feels like he has to go take a drink, right? He can't, at least against his boss, release his rage in actual violence. So instead, he releases it by going and getting a drink, right?
And then going home.
Yes, beating someone over whom he does have absolute authority, who doesn't have the power to resist him, right? He spends a whole evening getting humiliated by other people, by his boss, then by Weathers, and then, I mean, even his little triumph, right? Over Mr. Like, what's happened here in the office?
He embarrasses Paul.
Yeah, he embarrasses Mr. Allen, right? And this actually is another kind of point of contact with Little Chandler, right? Remember that Little Chandler was having fantasies about rich foreign women, right? Particularly about rich Jewish women. And Miss Delacour,
This is a rich, seemingly Jewish woman.
yes, is a rich woman of Jewish appearance, who Mr. Allen seems to be attracted to. Now, Delacour is a French name, right? It means of the heart, of the court. And what does Mr. Allen want Farrington to go get when Miss Delacour comes in?
Her contract.
It's not a contract. This is actually probably more of an interesting side note, but I think it gets at why Mr. Allen is so angry when Farrington, or at least as he perceives it, screws up.
The letters, right?
Yeah, he wants the letters, right, in the Delacour correspondence. Now, in turn of the 20th century British slang, French letters are condoms. So he's not literally asking Farrington to go get him some condoms, but there's a suggestion here that the air between Mr. Allen and Miss Delacour is sexually charged, right? When they're sitting together and she's smoothing the handle of her umbrella and he's throwing his right foot up jauntily, right, and sitting in a relaxed posture with her. And then he wants Farrington to go away as soon as he's come, right? It's like, okay, like, he brought me the letters, now go, right? You're no longer needed. So then what is it that makes Allen so angry then about Farrington's backtalk to him?
He's embarrassing him in front of his girl.
Yeah, Farrington humiliates Mr. Allen in front of Miss Delacour, whom he's trying to woo. and thus he has to humiliate Farrington even more in turn, right? So Farrington becomes the hero of his little friend group because of his, smart remark back, right? Mr. Allen asks him, do you take me for a fool? And Farrington replies, I don't think that's a fair question to put to me, sir, right? But what part of the story does Farrington omit when he's talking to his friends?
Where he gets fired.
What's that?
The part where he gets fired.
Well, he hasn't been fired yet, right? But he's likely to be. If you look on page 92, right? He stood in the doorway opposite to the office, watching to see if the cashier would come out alone. All the clerks passed out, and finally the cashier came out with the chief clerk. It was no use trying to say a word to him when he was with the chief clerk. The man felt that his position was bad enough. He had been obliged to offer an abject apology to Mr. Allen for his impertinence. Right? So he has had to get down on his knees and apologize to Mr. Allen. But he doesn't mention that part when he's out on a spree with his buddies, right? People don't buy you drinks because you apologize to your boss, right? They buy you drinks because you stuck it to him. So, we haven't said anything yet about a painful case, right? And I do want to make sure that we at least kind of touch on that one before we go. So, was there anything that you guys were particularly interested in or confused by in that story?
It reminds me of T.S. Eliot and
Okay, yeah, interesting. Yeah, go ahead. Elaborate.
It just reminded me of it a little bit because he was just seemed like kind of self-conscious and was always in like a routine, and I felt like like when Emily came into his life, it like disrupted his routine, so he was like just get out.
Yeah.
I think he had some sort of like OCD maybe or something, because he seemed like this, and then she comes in and he's like, you're messing everything up. Yeah. And then when she died, I was like, oh dang. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Mr. Duffy is, I think, in some ways actually pretty similar to Maria, right? He's an aging celibate, although he seems to be celibate by choice, right? And in fact, pretty much resistant to forming any kind of social ties with anyone permanently, right? Like if we look even at the very beginning of the story on page 107, can one of you start reading from Mr. James Duffy lived in Chapel Izod?
What page was that?
It is page 107.
107. Okay. Mr. James Duffy lived in Chapel Izod because he wished to live as far as possible from the city of which he was a citizen, and because he found all the other suburbs of Dublin mean, modern, and pretentious. He lived in an old, somber house, and from his windows he could look into the disused distillery or upwards along the shallow river on which Dublin is built. The lofty walls of his uncarpeted room were free from pictures. He had himself bought every article of furniture in the room, a black iron bedstead, an iron washstand, 4 cane chairs, a clothes rack, a coal scuttle, a fender, and irons, and a square table on which lay a double desk.
Okay, so that thing, we actually stopped there, right? So what does this tell us so far about Mr. James Duffy?
He's very minimalist and self-sufficient.
Okay, minimalist, yeah, what about him suggests self-sufficiency?
They stress or make a point to note that he bought everything that he wants.
Yep, he chose all of this furniture, right? And why has he even chosen the part of Dublin in which he lives?
He hates people.
Yeah. He wants to be as far away from other people as he fucking can, right?
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't blame him.
I mean, you got all these people with syphilis running around.
Yeah, he doesn't want to be another citizen.
Yeah, but then you'd think he'd want to live on, like, Chapel Izod is on the north side of the river. You'd want to be on the south side of the river, further from the red light district. But and then, yeah, like, when we get to his first meeting here with Mrs. Sinico, right on page 109, right, he's at a concert, and she speaks to him. Right, she says, "What a pity there is such a poor house tonight. It's so hard on people to have to sing to empty benches." So the first thing she says to him expresses, like, what?
Emptiness, loneliness,
Okay, emptiness and loneliness, but also,
a want for something social.
for whom though? When she says, it's so hard on people to have to sing to empty benches. Who's she thinking about?
singers.
Yeah, she's pitying the musicians, right? I feel sorry for these singers. They have to sing to such a small crowd. So the first emotion that Mrs. Sinico expresses in their conversations is sympathy. Right? Something that he doesn't really seem to have in abundance. In fact, we go to page 110, it talks about his brief time assisting at the meetings of the Irish Socialist Party, where he had felt himself a unique figure amidst a score of sober workmen in a garret lit by an inefficient oil lamp. When the party had divided into 3 sections, each under its own leader and its own garret, he had discontinued his attendances. The workmen's discussions, he said, were too timorous. The interest they took in the question of wages was inordinate. He felt that they were hard-featured realists and that they resented an exactitude which was the product of a leisure not within their reach. No social revolution, he told her, would be likely to strike Dublin for some centuries. So what's weird about somebody like Mr. Duffy hanging out with socialists?
Different views politically.
You would expect so, right? Given that, I mean, like, what is essentially, like, what's the key word in socialist?
Social.
Social, right? Yeah, that it's at least supposed to be about cooperation, right?
He doesn't seem too keen on that.
Yeah, he doesn't seem too keen on the idea of cooperation or community. And he looks down on these workmen, thinking that the question they take in the interest of wages is inordinate, right? Right, not for them. Right? He's, a relatively well-compensated bank employee. For these laborers that he's hanging out with at these party meetings, the question of wages is everything.
He also is surprised that she could talk to him not awkwardly.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to talk with people on other than a transactional level otherwise, right? The only other people we really see him talking to are like the girl who serves him his dinner, right? And that seems to be just, is your food not cooked? Or it's, oh no, it's fine, and then he pays her and leaves, right? All of his other conversations seem to be more or less businesslike. But even in this relationship with Mrs. Sinico, right? When she dies, right, 4 years after they have stopped talking to each other, what's his first response? Yeah, he's mad at her, right? That her death degrades him because getting hit by a train is so vulgar and commonplace.
Was it really an accident?
That's a good question.
I found myself wondering the same
Uh-huh.
thing. Did she purposely walk in front of that train?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, I feel, yeah, there are a lot of, like, I think about that a lot myself. It's like, there are a lot of suggestions that this is in fact a suicide.
She was obviously very depressed.
And it's a it's a slow moving train, right? There should have been plenty of, there
People
should
were
have been time
yelling
for,
at
yeah.
her.
Mhm.
And the fact that when she died and her husband in the newspaper, what did it say? It said, lived happily until about 2 years ago when his wife began to be rather intemperate in her habits. I was like,
Uh-huh.
did you really just put that in the newspaper?
Yeah.
And
Her daughter wrote that she was drinking and like they were
Uh-huh.
forcing her to go to AA meetings.
Yeah.
They were not
I mean,
nice.
Yeah.
put the gospel in the newspaper.
But yeah, it seems like, yeah, everything in the newspaper, like everybody who's quoted in the newspaper, like they mostly just seem to be absolving themselves of any blame, right? In fact, the last sentence is no blame attached to anyone. The husband is like, well, I was in Rotterdam, I don't know what was going on. The daughter was out giving a music lesson at the time of the death, right? We weren't around, right? But if this is a suicide, right? The whole no blame attached to anyone idea here. Who might attach some blame to himself here?
Duffy.
Yeah. And yet, let's keep in mind here, right, how long ago, at the time of her death, had she and Duffy broken off all contact? It's been 4 years, right? When did she start drinking? 2 years ago, right? So even in assuming that this is somehow his fault or his responsibility, how likely is that given the other circumstances that were given?
Well, he did leave her lonely.
Yeah.
And I think that's how he places the
Mhm.
blame on himself.
Yeah.
Is that he left her alone. He knew that her husband was never home. He traveled.
Uh-huh.
Her daughter
Yeah.
was never home. She was sitting in that room in the dark
Uh-huh.
by herself for years.
Yeah, I understand him like putting the blame on himself, but
Uh-huh.
it's just weird that he started drinking 2 years after that.
Yeah, that it takes 2 years, but yeah.
That will like it.
Maybe that was how long it took for her to finally snap.
Maybe I'm.
Mhm. But-
The train, like
Uh-huh.
the death by train, reminded me of the end of Anna Karenina
Uh-huh.
by Tolstoy.
Which Joyce would have certainly read. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. So I think there probably is an analogy there to that. I think that's right. Now I think you're also right to see some analogs with Prufrock here, though. Although I think that Eliot had not yet written Prufrock when Joyce wrote this story. But yeah, I think that there's kind of something similar in the modernist air, right? But yeah, I think that, like, at least my read of this is that Duffy's reaction to Mrs. Sinico's death is just kind of further evidence of his individualism and self-centeredness, and that he assumes that this somehow must be all about him. Right? He is. He's been reading. We find out near the end of the story. He's been reading Nietzsche. Right? He's been reading. Thus spake Zarathustra in the Gay Science, and Nietzsche's whole philosophy is about this kind of idea of the superior person, right? The person who is above and resistant to all emotional ties. And while Mrs. Sinico may not have had, I think he assumes that he is Mrs. Sinico's only emotional tie, when in fact the opposite is true, right? She was his only emotional tie.
Yeah, whenever she like put the hand on him, and after that he was like,
Yeah.
But was the reason for him being like, no, like never mind, don't want to do this, is because like of his celibacy, or did he like realize like, oh, this is getting romantic and you have a husband, like you're wrong?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think the story really adequately resolves. And we're about out of time, so we can't really draw that out yet, although we could maybe pick that up next time. But there are also some critics who have suggested that Duffy is gay and kind of deeply closeted, right? Like, he's living in a time and place where this cannot be openly expressed. And so that's part of what makes his reaction to Mrs. Sinico so extreme as a kind of sexual panic.
Also, I love how it said he always saw his relatives at Christmas and then to put them in the grave.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
Uh-huh.